Hey everybody, Mark over here at Twanger's Turntable. Hope you're all doing well and enjoying your days, your afternoon, your morning, whatever. Maybe it's evening. It's a world wide web here on the YouTube in the VC. So what I'm doing here today, just putting up another video. This one to interrupt some of the other stuff I've been doing. I'm going to enter one of the contests, and this one is for Edward over at Proghat. He was doing a contest probably a couple of weeks ago now. He began this, and it was a push for 400 subs. I see now, Edward, you've far exceeded that. I think the last check you were up around 470 or something. That's awesome. Congrats, man. That's great. So there's a couple of other contests going around. I would like to throw my support into those channels and maybe just mention Christian over at CGC Vinyl. He's also doing one. I don't know if I'll get a chance to do that one. And then there's some other threads happening. But I don't live on here, so unfortunately I can't enter them all or submit a video for everything that's happening. None of us can. Some make a valiant effort though, and that's good on you. But this is for Edward at Proghat, the push for 400. I have no doubt, probably by the time your contest is over, Edward, you'll probably be exceeding 500. So that's awesome. Good stuff. So essentially the gist of his contest, go over to his website. You've got to subscribe to his channel. And then it is essentially, I got my notes here, 3 favorite albums. Let me back up here. It's Proghat's 1960s contest, push for 400 subs. So it's a 1960s theme. So 3 favorite albums of the 60s, 3 favorite songs from the 60s, 3 favorite artists from the 60s, and a bonus question, favorite from 1968, the year of Edward's birth, which happens to be this year I was born as well. So 1968, that's an easy one for me. But I'll back up. I'll start with my 3 favorites from 1960. I don't have a lot, to be honest with you. I started going through the little vinyl that I do have. I don't have a lot from the 60s, and the things I do have from the 60s are generally from just a few artists. They're not very diverse. So I'll start with far and away my favorite. It's not even close, and I could have picked a couple, but this one just is a little better in my opinion, and that's the second from Led Zeppelin, Led Zeppelin 2. I could have picked Led Zeppelin 1. They were both released in '69, but this just, every tune on here is stellar in my opinion. And so yeah, that's my favorite, number 1. It's always difficult, I find, to pick favorites for me when I do top artists, top songs. It's so subjective, and it's mood. There's so many variables. So, but this one is consistently, if I'm going with 60s albums in the 60s, this would probably be at the top of my list every time. But the separation between the top and the top 10 is probably very minimal. But this is my top for sure. Zeppelin 2. Next up would be the Jimi Hendrix Experience and the debut, Are You Experienced? Just a killer album. I mean, every tune on here. Anybody who is familiar with Jimi Hendrix has probably heard every tune on here at some juncture. I mean, you know, Purple Haze. And actually, I'm not going to go through all the songs on these. It's just the albums themselves. Check them out if you haven't checked them out already. I find that hard to imagine, but hey, it's a very over 8 billion people in the world. So yeah, check it out. That's my number 2 from the 1960s. Number 3, again, with these guys, I could have gone with many of their albums, but I have to choose one. And I find quite often I go back to this as being my favorite from this artist. But again, with this artist, it's a very narrow margin between all of their albums. Certainly they're mid 60s to late 60s for me, and that's Sgt. Pepper's by the Beatles. Like I say, there's so many, and yeah, that would be number 3 for 1960 favorite releases from the 1960s. The next criteria was, what did I say? 3 favorite songs from the 60s. Yeah, a couple of these are going to be making multiple appearances, just because I don't have a vast collection, as I've mentioned. So, but easy to pick three for me. Dear Mr. Fantasy by Traffic, just a killer tune. It's one of the all-time best, but that's just, again, my opinion, and that's very subjective. But for me, just a great album. And I think I've mentioned this before. That song, which closes out side one on this album, is almost like none of the rest of the album. It stands out as being, because it's it's a very psych rock album, I think. But that song is just a killer tune. So that's number one. Number two, this has always been probably my favorite song by this band, this artist, or very near to being my favorite. And it's off their album Rubber Soul. Again, it's the Beatles, and In My Life. Just, I don't think I need to say much about that. It's just, if you've not heard it, I'm so sorry. you should hear it. In my opinion, I know there's people who are not Beatles fans, but that's all fine and good. But In My Life is just an incredible song and an incredible album. I think just a little bit. I'm gonna deviate a little just because I need to with the Beatles. I was never a huge Beatles fan. I've adopted being a Beatles fan due to Mrs. Twanger's Turntable, my wife Jen. She was a huge Beatles fan right from the time she was born, because her mom was such a huge Beatles fan. So I have to shout them out. You know, my wife and her mom, my mother-in-law, just a huge Beatles fan. And yeah, this was probably the first Beatles album I heard, although I didn't know it at the time. But when I think back, and it was quite inadvertently, because I certainly didn't have it in my collection. And so I think it's probably right up there as one of my favorites as well. As I mentioned before, that's pretty tough to do and pick a favorite. So that's two. The third one is also from one of my favorite albums, and you know, being a drummer enthusiast, I had to go with, off of this track, Moby Dick, of course, Bonham. Just, that's one of the tracks that has always stood out to me. I mean, there's so many good tracks, but of course, I mean, come on, Moby Dick is just such a classic. For me, it's one of my favorites for sure. Three favorite artists. No, three favorite artists from the 60s. Not three favorite artists. I'm sorry, I misread that. A favorite artist from the 60s. Well, I've already mentioned, I can't really go with Zeppelin because the bulk of their catalog is from the 70s. So almost their entire catalog by this band is from the 60s, and that would be the Beatles. I need to make sure I did that right. I'm looking at the criteria. Three favorite albums, 60s, Zeppelin 2, Jimi Hendrix, Sgt. Pepper's. Three favorite songs, Mr. Fantasy, Moby Dick, My Life. Three favorite artists from the 60s. Okay, let me pause that because I need to pull a couple more. Right back. Okay, my bad. In fact, it was just to name a favorite artist from the 60s, not three favorite artists. That would kind of seem redundant, but it was just number three, the number three in the criteria. So that's what I was misreading. So my favorite artist from the 60s is the Beatles, for sure. I mean, with their catalog, I kind of like all their stuff, but I'm much more of a fan of the later stuff, the White Album, Sgt. Pepper's, Rubber Soul, as I alluded to. Any of the stuff that came, well, even the early stuff I do like, so I digress. It's all good, all the Beatles. And the bonus question, favorite of 1968, and for sure that is, as I just mentioned, the White Album. I mean, as far as albums that came out in 68, it's kind of funny because 67 was when my wife was born, Sgt. Pepper's, and then 68 was when I was born, the White Album. I mean, just incredible parts of the Beatles discography. Could have gone with, as far as favorite albums from the Beatles, I could have gone with Abbey Road. In recent years, that's crept up much higher. I really appreciate that album much more than I used to. Although, having said that, it's not like I had many years of listening to the Beatles. This is relatively essentially the last 30 years or so that I've been listening to the Beatles. Well, a little more than 30 years after I met my wife, because she was such a huge fan. But this one for sure, as far as 1968, it would have to go to the White Album. So that's it. That's my entry to your contest, Edward. I hope I've met the criteria and got my hat in there. And most importantly, support your channel. And to everyone watching, go and check out Edward's channel. Subscribe, like, share. And yeah, just if you go to a channel and you view their content, just hit a like button and subscribe. It only takes a second and it doesn't cost anything. So I'll leave it at that. Take care, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you here again next time on Twanger's Turntable. Cheers, everyone.